Good evening, everyone. I think everybody's done transiting in and out. Welcome. My name is Rosemary Sands. I'm the director of the Center for Norbertine Studies, and I'm delighted to see all of you here tonight. I would like to, they've already left the premises, but I would like to thank Dr. Sarah Parks, Dr. Elan New, Elaine Moss, and all of the students who performed for us this evening. It was just a beautiful way to start our Heritage Week. As many of you know, the college celebrates its birthday on the 10th of October every year. This year we're turning 121 years old. And it has been a tradition for many, many years for Heritage Week to be filled with many events, one of them the concert, and then the Heritage Week lecture that's sponsored by the Center for Norbertine Studies. This year we also have a co-collaborator, and that is the Cassandra Voss Center under the direction of Billy Karenko, who's here in the front row. And we've got a whole year of programming lined up, both at the Cassandra Voss Center and the Center for Norbertine Studies. Our theme this year is Year of Norbertine Women, and we're very, very excited about that, and I'll mention a little bit more in a minute. Before I do that, though, I would be remiss if I were not to introduce Meredith Hansen, the program coordinator for the Center for Norbertine Studies. Please stand up. Meredith does all the detail work. I have grandiose ideas, and I kind of run with stuff, and I'm usually a little bit overly ambitious with what I want to do. I've been thinking about the Year of Norbertine Women for 3 years, and then I kind of like, okay, I want to do that, and Meredith is the one that makes sure it gets done. So those of you who know anything about the history of the order, Norbert, not that I'm comparing myself to Norbert, but Norbert was the big idea guy, and Hugh of Foss was always running behind him with the checklist, saying, we've got to do this, we've got to do this, this has to be done. Meredith is my Hugh. And she keeps me on task so things come off as well as they do. I'm thrilled to see so many of you here tonight. As we know, not only celebrate Heritage Week, but equally as importantly, we're kicking off our Year of Norbertine Women, as I mentioned. This evening's speaker is Dr. Yvonne Seale, who is an assistant professor of history at the State University of New York Geneseo campus, and comes to us by way of Ireland, where she did her undergraduate degree at Trinity College in Dublin. She did her master's degree at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and she did her doctoral degree at the University of Iowa, where she happened to write her doctoral dissertation, all 500 or more or less pages, on Norbertine women at the time of Norbert, so going back almost 900 years. And I think she crossed my radar about 3 years ago, and that was when I started thinking about Year of Norbertine Women, because I already had in my mind, there were a couple of people who were doing, someone who's spoken here before, did the Norbertine Women in Germany, Shelley Woolbrink, and Carol Neal has done some work, and there are other people, and one of Yvonne's colleagues also has done quite a bit of research and publishing on Norbertine items and women, and she was our speaker last spring. Heather Waka spoke on the Prémontré cartulary, and so I started thinking about how we could fit all this in, and Dr. Seale's name came across my radar. She has a wonderful blog, so I'd encourage all of you who can to look her up. Just type in Yvonne Seale blog, and it will surprise you, and you'll learn something new, and she posts beautiful images. She's also a lot of fun to follow on Twitter. And anyway, beyond that, Dr. Seale is a Premonstratensian scholar, as I mentioned. She has published in many, many journals and has presented at conferences and is in the process with Heather Waka, who I mentioned before. They're in the process of producing a digital and print version of the Prémontré cartulary. Those of you who know something about the order was founded in Prémontré, France. They settled there in 1120 in the spring. They took their first vows, Christmas Eve of 1121, so the birthday party goes on for about a year and a half when we celebrate the 900th coming up pretty soon. And the cartulary is a book of very, very important foundational documents, things that had happened that were of great significance for the order, are tucked into this cartulary. And so they have transcribed it, and they are putting together a print and a digital version, which we're hoping will be out within a year and a half or 2 years, which will be very, very exciting. It's great for me to see new Norbertine scholarship on the horizon. There aren't too many of us out there who do dedicate our lives to Premonstratensian scholarship, so it's always fun to have more people under the tent. I had the pleasure of listening to Dr. Seale this morning. She lectured to both my humanities course, Communio and the History of the Norbertines, and the Intro to Women and Gender Studies course, which is taught by Professor Karinko, both classes combined. And we both had interest because my students are studying the history of the order. Obviously, the students in the Women and Gender Studies class are learning about different things and different ways to look at scholarship and documentation on women, and Dr. Seale did not disappoint. She's a wonderful lecturer, very entertaining. I learned a lot this morning, and the hour and a half flew by. I am sure you will be treated to just as equally an entertaining evening tonight. Before I step off the stage here and let you have your time with Dr. Seale, a couple of housekeeping details. The restrooms are just outside the door. The women's room is on my right, and the men's room is off here on my left. There's also a sign-up sheet for my students. It's just outside the door. There's like a radiator out there. It's a yellow-lined piece of paper like this. So make sure you sign in, first and last name, before you leave tonight. And also, tables that are down the steps have swag from our Year of Norbertine Women. So we are introducing, in addition to the lecture tonight, we have 2 lectures in the spring, and then we also have monthly events for those of you who are on campus, lunch and learns, very informal sessions, and every month we roll out information on a different female Norbertine who was significant in the order, and we also have little baseball trading cards and little pins, buttons, and so we've got some of that from our featured Norbertine woman, Rick Vera, who was the very first Norbertine sister who joined the order in 1121, so she was working right alongside Norbert, we presume, and that's all outside for the taking. Again, thank you all for coming tonight, and help me to welcome Dr. Yvonne Seale. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind and very undeserved introduction, Rosemary, and of course for the invitation to speak to you all here this evening. I've had such a warm welcome here at St. Norbert College, particularly in Dr. Sands and Dr. Krinko's class this morning, and I'm really grateful for that. I'd also like to acknowledge the cheerful patience with which Meredith Hansen made the various travel arrangements to get me here from New York, even though apparently flying in on Sunday, a day when the Green Bay Packers were playing, was probably not the smartest thing I have learned. But we got here anyway. Okay, so this evening, as you have probably guessed by now, I will be talking about the Premonstratensian women of medieval France. I'll be exploring how these women's lives provide us with some fascinating evidence about the intersection of power, gender, and faith in the Middle Ages. I'll be arguing that paying very close attention to the surviving written, art historical, and archaeological evidence about medieval nuns forces us to reconsider a lot of gendered assumptions that form the foundation of so many general works on the history of medieval Europe, as well as the more specific assumptions that have underpinned a lot of the scholarship on Premonstratensian women. And in a sense, what I'm going to be arguing this evening is that we can use the treatment of nuns in history texts as a kind of litmus test for some pretty big historical questions as a whole. And now generally, when I am speaking to an audience about the historic importance of women religious, I can pretty much guarantee that a good chunk of them are going to be sitting there and thinking, nuns? Really? Maybe not so much this evening, but still it's not an unreasonable question for the average person to ask, given the decline in vocations in the Catholic Church in the West in recent decades. Many people may never have met a Catholic religious sister, let alone a cloistered nun. I know from speaking with a lot of my own students that the word nun conjures up an image of Whoopi Goldberg in the Sister Act movies, or Aubrey Plaza et al.'s foul-mouthed turn in The Little Hours, or one of, I have discovered there's a genre of really terrible nunsploitation horror movies. I don't recommend them. none of this, if you look at the sort of pop culture presence, really speaks to political power or social significance, however much the Sister Act musical numbers get your toes tapping. But of course, there are many contemporary religious sisters who are involved in social advocacy, and perhaps most famously right now in the US, the Nuns on the Bus tour led by Sister Simone Campbell. They lobby politicians and raise awareness about issues like immigration reform and wealth inequality. Their medieval and early modern forebears, their foremothers, if you will, like the abbesses of the famous French Abbey of Fontevraud, similarly had political influence, and also enormous social and economic power, thanks to Fontevraud's vast estates. Today, though, I'm going to be talking about women who lived in far humbler religious communities than that of the Abbey of Fontevraud, and who didn't have the ear of French royalty in the way that the abbesses of Fontevraud did. Instead, I'm going to focus on the women who were the members of the Order of Prémontré, also known to scholars as the Premonstratensians, or to most people here this evening as the Norbertines. These people, these women, didn't live in abbeys on the scale of Fontevraud. They didn't commission great works of art or directly influence royal policy, at least not to the best of my knowledge. But their lives and careers are still historiographically and historically important. And in the rest of my talk this evening, I'm going to make the case for why. And this is normally the point in a talk where I've got to spend a lot of time explaining where and when the Premonstratensian Order was founded, and talk about who helped to found it, and to talk about just how successful it was in the High Middle Ages, with a rapid expansion from the 1120s, seeing houses founded from Ireland in the west to Jerusalem in the east, and from Sweden in the north to Spain in the south. And I don't really have to do that here this evening, which is a nice change. But normally, even when I'm speaking to other medieval historians, I have to do a little bit of Prémontré 101. Because other medievalists might be very familiar with religious orders like the Cistercians or the Dominicans or the Franciscans, but the medieval Premonstratensians are still relatively unknown. And this comparative obscurity has led to the Premonstratensians having only fairly minor roles in many of the general texts on medieval church history. When they do, they generally appear to provide a kind of mini case study of church misogyny. I'm going to beg your indulgence for a few moments as I visit what I'm sure is probably fairly familiar ground for some of you, just in order to set up the contrast between the standard narrative and then what we find when we truly dig into the sources. So the standard narrative about the Premonstratensian order in the Middle Ages is this. When it was founded in the early 1120s, it consisted largely of double houses, so that is monasteries which were home to both brothers and sisters who slept in different dormitories but otherwise worked and prayed together. This was the case with the Abbey of Braine, which you see here in northern France, where the brothers lived in the main building, but the sisters lived a short distance away in individual mansiunculi, Latin for sort of a tiny house, essentially. But in 1140, the order's general chapter, or main governing body, forcibly abolished all of the double houses. This marginalized the women and forced them out of the order's main communities in order to live in much smaller, separate ones. Then in 1198, the Pope issued a formal decree which completely expelled all of the women from the Premonstratensian order. No more houses of Premonstratensian sisters at all. This is the cover, I should say, of one of the classic introductory works on the history of the medieval church, one which I remember relying heavily on as an undergraduate any time an essay came due. R.W. Southern's Western Society and the Church in the Middle Ages is one of the examples that promotes this sort of traditional narrative that I've been talking about. In fact, he uses it to form the dramatic beginning of a chapter called Women and Other Outcasts. Southern wrote that the Premonstratensian sisters were forced out of the order to begin their wanderings because of anti-feminine criticisms which sought to get rid of the intruders. Now, this is a very vivid and dramatic framing, right? Groups of poor unfortunate nuns forced out to wander the byways of medieval France. And it definitely appeals to our idea of what the Middle Ages must have been like. It's also a story that some people are very invested in. My very first research trip to France, a senior academic spent a lot of time telling me that I was never going to find anything about the Premonstratensian sisters because all the sources had been destroyed and they hadn't been around for very long anyway, so I should just give up and switch dissertation topics. She said, middle-class men haven't been studied very much. Seriously. This traditional framing is one that's based on a very narrow reading of certain texts, and a narrow reading, moreover, that's heavily influenced by the views of several 17th century writers. Charles-Louis Hugo and Jean Lepage were both proud members of the Premonstratensian order, and they preserved many sources which would otherwise be lost to us. So we do owe a great debt of gratitude to them. Their narrative of the order's early centuries remains very influential for later scholars. But Hugo and Lepage were in many ways men of their time, the product of a counter-Reformation world in which women's roles within the Catholic Church were increasingly circumscribed and their agency frowned upon. To put it another way, the history of Premonstratensian women that we're telling today is still largely based upon work like that of these men who were contemporaries of the Puritans. And you don't need to know a huge amount about, say, the Salem witch trials to see why that might result in some work which I believe the youth would term problematic. All that is even before we get to the fact that there is no papal decree of 1198 that kicks all of the women out of the order. And believe me, I've looked, and it doesn't exist. So this standard narrative, which is presented by Southern and others, doesn't fit with the evidence provided by so much of the written sources or by the archaeological evidence. There is a decline in the number of houses of Premonstratensian women in French-speaking areas in the later Middle Ages. But as I researched the topic, I kept finding that both double houses and houses of Premonstratensian sisters in general lasted well beyond the year 1198. The double monastery of Schäftlarn, for instance, survived until 1803 and was home to both brothers and sisters until that date. And several scholars would say, well, this is a German-speaking area, and the German Premonstratensians and the French Premonstratensians just did things differently, and the French Premonstratensians are the true Premonstratensians. Therefore, the Premonstratensians really did get rid of their sisters, and this traditional narrative is true. Now, you've heard of the no true Scotsman fallacy, right? This is at play here. But even in France, this narrative doesn't hold true. Here, for example, is an 18th century plan of what was once the community at Bonneuil in the Somme in northern France. And you might just be able to see that marked on the map here is the outline of the ancienne cloîture, the former cloister wall. There is documentary evidence of sisters living within those walls until the late 15th century. That is, even with my terrible humanities professor math, long after 1198. Many of the buildings still stand at Bonneuil, but since it's now a privately owned farm and the owners are not super keen on having historians poke around their home, I've had to content myself with being a creeper on Google Street View. But this is fairly undeniable evidence, right? You don't invest money and resources into building structures for people whom you don't want around. It makes no sense. The more I dug into the sources, the clearer it became to me that something did happen to the Premonstratensian women in France, but it's more complicated than groups of poor passive nuns being kicked out into the cold by moustache-twirling villainous monks. After all, these women, by and large, had made an active choice to join the Premonstratensians in the first place. One of the few glimpses that we have of the passionate vocation which drove some women to join the early order comes from a letter written by the Abbot Philippe of Laumont to the Abbot Hugh of Prémontré at some point in the late 1150s. Philippe described how an unnamed niece of his had experienced a religious conversion while visiting a Premonstratensian community. Without asking anyone else, she'd impulsively put on a nun's habit, cut off her hair, and prostrated herself in front of the altar to take a vow of virginity and membership to the order, just like you can see this modern Dominican nun doing here. In so doing, Philippe's niece had circumvented all of the procedures that a woman was supposed to follow when seeking admission to the Premonstratensians' ranks. She wanted in just that much. Another woman who wanted to enter the Premonstratensian order, Ode of Rivreuil, was supposedly a great beauty whose parents wanted to arrange a fantastic marriage for her. Ode was not on board with this. She mutilated her own nose and deliberately tried to catch a disfiguring skin disease so that her looks would be destroyed and she would be allowed to become a nun. The modern artist has presumably chosen to depict her before the home rhinoplasty. So why were these women so keen to join the Premonstratensians in the 12th century? Well, at this point in time, the order's way of life was a relatively new concept. Medieval Christians had long distinguished between the life of the laity and the life of the monastics, between the lives of people who took religious vows and those who didn't. They also made a further distinction among those who took vows. Were they active in the world like priests, or did they set themselves apart from the world like monks and nuns? This distinction was often explained with reference to the biblical story of Martha and Mary. Mary sat at Jesus' feet listening to his teachings, while her sister hurried around preparing refreshments for their guest. Mary was contemplative, Martha was active. The early Premonstratensians, like many of the other new religious groups that emerged in the early 12th century, decided that the best form of life wouldn't be to decide on one or other of these options. It would be to merge them in the spirit of the meme. Right? Why not both? They could spend time in quiet prayer and meditation, but they could also serve in parishes and hospitals and as preachers. And this might seem like a fairly obvious form of religious life to us nowadays, but it was a radically new idea in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. And that's one of the reasons why we think that women flocked to the newly established Premonstratensian order. Once they had made their vows, Premonstratensian sisters' lives were guided by the statutes or rules of their order. And these statutes give us a sense of the daily round of life, which involved a lot of hard work, broken by prayer and religious services. We know that, as you can see here, our Premonstratensian sisters kneeling on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. The sisters were required to wear habits and veils made out of linen and coarse wool. They also had to make their own clothes, and given the labor requirements of cloth production in the Middle Ages, most of the time that they weren't praying, the sisters would have been spinning wool to make thread, weaving cloth to make habits, or processing sheepskin to make cloaks. Some of them tended to the sheep or helped to produce cheese from the flock's milk. And as much as possible, their work was to be done in total silence. If they had to communicate, it would be through sign language alone. Moreover, we know that occasionally the sisters fostered and perhaps provided a basic education to small children. We know that they worked in xenodokia, which is a kind of a cross between a hospital and a hostel for travelers or pilgrims. They were also, per the statutes, banned from keeping pets, but the very fact that they had to put this into the rules means that there were probably a few sisters who were keeping pets that they shouldn't have. Why else would the statutes take care to forbid them from keeping, and I quote, deer, hares, swans, peacocks, bears, or apes? Maybe they needed help with the spinning. So these statutes give us a sense of who these women were expected to be, right? Active, sensible managers of farms, infirmaries, and small children. And if you've ever spent time around a toddler, you will know that you cannot successfully manage one while being shy and retiring. So now that we know what they did, let us get a sense of where these women lived. In France, most Premonstratensian sisters lived in relatively small communities, in places that were rural but not remote. They were generally within walking distance of a town or village, although a few, such as Beaumont-les-Nonains in the north of France or La Rochelle on the west coast, were in urban contexts. This was a pattern followed also by Premonstratensian men, although their abbeys were generally on a much larger scale. Most women's houses, though, as I said, were rural. The sources from medieval France almost always refer to them as curtes sororum or domus sororum, courts of sisters or houses of sisters. These are simple structures arranged around a central courtyard, often very close to, if not physically attached, to a church. Bruyère in the Aisne seems like a typical example, and the sketch that you see here on screen was drawn up when the property and its associated land were leased out as a farm in 1742, but almost certainly this shows the original medieval footprint of the buildings. Each structure is arranged around the cour, or the central courtyard, and then between the buildings and the small river Meuse, which is on the left of the map here, to the south of the buildings in reality, is a wooded area. Other areas are labelled garden and pasture, likely indicating agricultural activities were taking place, and the roads which lead away in either direction would take you to various villages after about a half-hour's walk. In fact, to get to and from several villages in the area would require you to pass by or quite close to the Courtes of Bruyère. This seems to reflect a deliberate desire on the part of the Premonstratensian sisters to be anchored in small communities across the rural landscape, and so not out of scale with the homes of the peasants and tenant farmers who lived around them. Frustratingly, though, no female Premonstratensian community in France has been excavated. Even in the instances where their churches have survived, as at Chéry-Chartreuve, they have been converted nowadays into storage places and sadly left to rot. It's such a shame that very little has been done to protect this chapel. All of the decor has been stripped, the altars removed, and the floor is gone. It's not the most impressive piece of medieval architecture you're going to find in France, which has medieval architecture all over the place, but it's still a lovely example of late 12th or early 13th century Romanesque. And we've ended up in a little bit of a vicious cycle, therefore, where because of a lack of ongoing preservation and excavation, it's assumed that there's nothing out there about Premonstratensian sisters that's worth preservation or excavation, and so scholars really haven't explored these sites anywhere near enough. Some buildings, though, are better preserved, and if we pay close attention to them, we get a sense of what Premonstratensian sisters valued, what they thought was important to their own personal faith. This is important given that these women are likely to represent the mainstream of non-elite religious belief in this period. The building that you see on screen is the only surviving structure from the community of Aubterre in the Auvergne in central France. This was once Aubterre. This was once the chapel. Aubterre was established in about 1150 by Gilbert and Pétronille, Lord and Lady of Escol. Gilbert had been away on crusade, and now he and his wife, it seemed, once he returned, decided to retire to religious communities. Gilbert set up a Premonstratensian house for men at Neuffontaine, while a few kilometers away, Pétronille founded the female community of Aubterre. She entered the religious life there together with her daughter, Poncy. Sadly, almost none of Aubterre's archives have survived. They were largely destroyed during the Franco-Spanish Wars of the 1650s. But we know that the house at Aubterre survived until at least the early 17th century. The last known prioress or head of the community was a woman called Diane d'Apchon, and she was installed in office in 1603. Now again, I'm not a math person, but that's a while after 1198. The farmhouse, which was built on one side of the chapel at Aubterre, sadly obscures what are probably the remains of the cloister, and the tomb niches, which you can maybe just about make out on the wall there, which may be the resting place of either Pétronille or Poncy, or both. But it's what is inside the chapel of Aubterre which makes it stand out amongst the surviving remains, the physical remains, of Premonstratensian female houses in France. It's home to medieval frescoes. On stylistic grounds, these have been dated to between 1175 and 1225, and mostly they are quite standard religious images. For instance, the south wall shows scenes from Jesus' life and passion, such as his baptism and flagellation. One image shows the descent from the cross, a topic popular in Western European art from the 10th century onwards. Two figures, and you can see here, are likely Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, retrieving Jesus' body to give it a proper burial. There are also two female figures, likely the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene, both making gestures of mourning and clutching at Christ's body. One of the scenes that I find most interesting, though, is on the north wall. This shows a central group of three female saints. The figure on the left is Catherine of Alexandria, a supposed martyr of the 4th century, who was condemned to death on the breaking wheel by the Roman Emperor Maxentius. And you can see here at her feet are her two wheels. These are her attributes or her symbols. During the Middle Ages, Catherine was second only to the Virgin Mary as a popular female saint, and as a virgin martyr was particularly venerated by young unmarried women. The middle figure is Margaret of Antioch, sometimes known as Marina of Antioch. She's another virgin martyr, although probably of dubious historicity. She became extremely popular in the West in the aftermath of the Crusades, so it's unsurprising to find her represented in a church founded by a former crusader and his wife. Margaret is shown here standing on, or perhaps emerging from, Satan in the form of a dragon. You're going to have to trust me, that's a dragon. In her hand, she holds the cross which her legend claimed she was carrying when she was swallowed by the beast. The presence of the cross gave the dragon such a sick tummy that he spat her back up and she could escape. And so thanks to her safe delivery, Margaret became a favorite of pregnant women. The figure on the right is likely yet another virgin martyr, Barbara, who also had origins in the Eastern Mediterranean and whom modern scholars are pretty sure was just invented in the early Middle Ages. Barbara is shown holding a chalice, which is representative of her intercessory role on behalf of the dying. Beneath Catherine, though, and to her left, are these two figures, their hands raised in a gesture of supplication. They're quite badly damaged, but it's possible that this might be Gilbert and Pétronille, or maybe Pétronille and Poncy. So taken together, these murals give us a rare glimpse at the personal piety of Premonstratensian sisters. The emphasis in the artwork is on the affective or emotional experience of Christ's suffering, his limp body being removed from the cross, the women's hands reaching out to comfort and support him. It also gives space to female saints who suffered but were ultimately triumphant. These are images that the Premonstratensian sisters would have prayed and meditated in front of, trying to enter into the experience of Christ's passion. They didn't try to overcome the suffering, fragile nature of their human bodies which, by very virtue of their femaleness, were generally framed in the Middle Ages as weaker and more prone to sin, but they instead embraced that as a means of better gaining salvation. But if that's the micro picture of where Premonstratensian sisters lived in the Middle Ages, what about the macro? If we zoom out a little bit for a moment, this map shows all of the medieval Premonstratensian houses that I have been able to find in French-speaking areas. And a moment's look at it immediately encourages us to start asking some questions. Why the clusters in some areas and the lack of presence in others? Why were women drawn to the order in such numbers in Picardy and the Champagne region, but hardly at all, if you draw a line south from Paris, hardly at all west of that? Why do clusters of women-only houses seem to be concentrated in border areas, particularly along the frontier between those areas which were, at least nominally, under the control of the French king, and those regions which were part of the Holy Roman Empire? Sadly, no one in the Middle Ages thought to leave behind a helpful plan in which they explained why they chose to build houses in particular locations. But several historians of women's monasticism in the Middle Ages have noted that female religious communities were often built in liminal or border regions. Medieval borders or transition points were oftentimes fairly fuzzy in an age before Google Maps, and they were often identified by landmarks like buildings. Given that women's houses were often perceived as less overtly politicized or militarized than those of their male counterparts, and certainly less so than a castle or other defensive fortification, it's entirely possible that nobles, lords, kings may have deliberately chosen to found women's houses as a form of what political scientists would call soft power, right? You can't claim to be a manly king if you're threatened by a group of innocent nuns, right, showing up on your doorstep. The concentration of female communities in border areas, such as eastern Picardy, northern Champagne, and the Rhineland, may also reflect the regions in which the Premonstratensian founder Norbert of Xanten had once preached. Maybe it was his personal charisma, which was one of the key pulls. But one of the deeply frustrating things about researching Premonstratensian sisters in France is that there are no surviving documents known to be written by one of them. When I first started working on the order, I had grand dreams that I was going to march into an archive and find this overlooked cache somewhere. That didn't pan out. The most promising hints in archival inventories generally resulted in a very Gallic shrug of the shoulder and "Désolé, madame, la guerre." Sorry, madam, the war. But we do have some sources written by male members of the order, mostly letters, that give us a glimpse at these women's lives. And although what they tell us is inevitably told through male voices, the letters still show us women who are active participants in their own lives. They had their own goals, their own networks, their own ways of negotiating or internalizing misogynistic ideas, and their own ideals as to what the purpose of religious life, of their religious life, was. For reasons of time this evening, I'm going to focus on some of the letters written by one person, the abbot Gervais l'Anglais, Gervais the Englishman, who headed the Premonstratensian order for several years in the early 13th century, between 1209 and 1220. We have more letters by Gervais than by any other medieval abbot of Prémontré, some 149 in total, compared to a handful, if that, for most of the other abbots. The letters don't survive in the original, just in later copies made by someone who admired Gervais as a Latin stylist. And frustratingly, this copyist was definitely much more interested in style than in substance, so he often excludes the beginnings and endings of the letters, and this means we've oftentimes got to guess to whom they were written or when. But even taking all of these source difficulties into account, these letters provide an unequaled look at how the Premonstratensian order functioned in the years immediately either side of the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. This was a period when the broader church was grappling with issues of reform, and the Premonstratensian order itself was trying to better define, or maybe the word is redefine, its own spiritual orientation as its expansion began to falter. Should Premonstratensians remain active in the wider community, or should they become more contemplative and cloistered? The letters of the reform-minded Gervais tackle these issues not just in the abstract, but also in the practical. In several of them, we see what happened when women's actions butted up against the goals of a male leader who was concerned with imposing a more uniform level of discipline across the order. We see what happened when reforming rhetoric met real-life situations. And as we'll see, women could use their personal connections in order to resist unwanted reform efforts or to negotiate institutional regulations with varying degrees of success. So with all that in mind, let's dive into the letters and get a sense of the kinds of stubborn women whom Gervais encountered. At some point, Gervais received a now lost letter from Barthélemy of Grandcourt, who was the abbot of the monastery of Saint-Aubert de Cambrai. Cambrai is located a good 75 kilometers north of Prémontré, so it's about 2 days' walk. Barthélemy had evidently written to petition Gervais for leniency about an unnamed Premonstratensian conversa. A conversa is a general term in Latin that's used to describe a woman who had decided to enter the Premonstratensian religious life in some capacity. The woman had been expelled from her community. It's not specified which one, but internal evidence in the letter leads me to believe that it's probably Macquencourt. The conversa had sought the help of the abbot Barthélemy and of several other important male ecclesiastics in order to be readmitted. Gervais's response lays out some of the backstory as to what had happened here. The conversa had been expelled because she'd committed an act of scandalum. What this means exactly isn't clear, and Gervais was coy about clarifying. There are obvious sexual connotations to the word scandal nowadays, or political, or both. You know how a Shonda Rhimes show tends to go by now. But in the Middle Ages, scandalum could mean any act or utterance which induced another person to sin. Setting a bad example was scandalous. Gervais thought that clarifying exactly what this conversa had done would bring dishonor on the whole order, and that neither Barthélemy nor any of the other lobbyists would have advocated for her if they'd known that this was not her first time to be in trouble with the order's hierarchy. Several years before, she'd committed another act of scandalum. Then, as now, the conversa had called upon a network of great men, as Gervais termed them, to argue her case. And their advocacy had resulted in her being allowed to stay in her community, although the brothers of the house had been sent away to live separately from the women. But now the conversa had done the same thing again, iterum incidet in idipsum. And the statutes which governed Premonstratensian life were very clear about this. You got a second chance, but you didn't get a third one. And the conversa had been expelled. So the first half of Gervais's letter lays out this very hardline, uncompromising approach, which is very much of a piece with what we would expect to see, going by the statutes of the order and going by that traditional historiographical narrative that I talked about, right? The male hierarchy forcing out the disruptive women. But the letter's only half over. You can almost hear Gervais sigh as he continues, but we're going to give her another chance. The conversa clearly still knew how to work her network of ecclesiastical contacts, and so the rules would be bent for her. She would be readmitted, though at a different Premonstratensian community, the house at Harchy. Gervais concludes his letter with the pious hope that the sisters there would provide a righteous example for this unruly conversa. Now, if this was just a lone example in all of those surviving letters of Gervais of a woman using connections to get preferential treatment, we could dismiss it as an anomaly. Maybe she just came from a wealthy family which was willing to manipulate the system in order for her to get ahead. That happens. But other letters show that our scandalous conversa wasn't unique. In about 1218, the new Bishop of Toul, a guy called Gérard of Vaudemont-Lorraine, wrote to Gervais. This time, Gérard was pleading for leniency on behalf of an entire community of Premonstratensian women. They lived at Chebray, which is now an uninhabited spot somewhere in these woods near the small town of Cuissy, which is itself about a day's walk from Prémontré. The abbot of Cuissy had expelled the women from the house at Chebray and excommunicated all of them. Again, Gervais refuses to say why all of this happened, but he describes the women as disobedient. Reading between the lines of his letter, I think that the women may have been defying the recent imposition of stricter rules concerning both passive and active castration for the order. In other words, the rules that made it more difficult for the sisters to go outside of the walls of their community, but also for other people to come inside of them. Gervais is extremely critical of the women in his letter to Bishop Gerard, but again he sets up an initially harsh stance that he doesn't quite follow through on. Whatever the women had done, it was serious enough that they should have been irrevocably expelled from the order. But Gervais was willing to readmit at least some of them. Those women who, while excommunicated, had obeyed the Premonstratensian hierarchy and remained in domibus alienis, in the houses of others, would be permitted to return to Chipre. I'm not exactly sure, I have to admit, what that means in this context. Does this mean that the women had willingly been confined in other religious communities, or just that they had obediently stayed away from Chipre itself during this period of conflict? The Latin is ambiguous. But regardless, the women who returned were to be penitent and to observe the order's rules strictly. If they did so, the female community at Chipre would continue. However, any women who persisted in their stubbornness, in sua consumatia perstiterunt, and who had not remained in domibus alienis, would not get such a happy ending. They were to be permanently expelled. So there is some attempt at compromise here, but Gervais concludes his letter on a rather ominous note. The women's conduct would remain a scar on the entire Premonstratensian order, he said, one which had the potential to reopen and to fester so foully that no poultice could cure it. In such cases, Gervais concluded bluntly, abscidamus, we amputate. Perhaps he went on to do just that. This is the last appearance of the House of Chipre in the historical record. So these two letters give us a picture of the Premonstratensian women who were at odds with the order's hierarchy in the early 13th century, and who used external connections to work around institutional restrictions with varying degrees of success. Gervais's reforming agenda clearly led to some discontent. But we've got to be careful to avoid characterizing him as one of those moustache-twirling villains determined to kick all of the women out of the order. He was clearly capable of compromise based on context, and he was also capable of advocating for women. For instance, at some point between 1213 and 1216, Gervais wrote to Hugh of Pierrepont, who was Bishop of Liège. At issue was the unnamed niece of one Prior B of Prémontré. From a young age, she'd attached herself to a group of women whom Gervais described as having both the name of religious and presenting a pious appearance. In other words, they walked the walk. The girls' devout conduct had attracted the approval of the Abbot Helinus of the Premonstratensian Abbey of Fleuref, in what is now southern Belgium. Gervais therefore wrote to Bishop Hugh, urging him to facilitate the young woman's desire to become an inclusa, which is a kind of religious who pursued a solitary, ascetic life within the walls of a monastery. Here we see Gervais working as part of a chain of male ecclesiastics to help a young woman with a religious vocation. One last letter, this time sent perhaps late in 1218 to Geoffrey, the head of the now vanished English Premonstratensian Abbey of Newhouse in Lincolnshire. This bridge is sadly all that's left of the site. Gervais wrote to Geoffrey to discuss the case of a woman known only as N, who wished to become a Premonstratensian but under very specific conditions. She was a widow, whom Gervais described as consumed by grief and dismayed in spirit. She'd been left financially destitute after her husband's death. Gervais granted Geoffrey's petition that N be allowed to take the veil as a Premonstratensian sister while remaining at her current residence. In other words, to be a Premonstratensian who didn't live in a Premonstratensian community. Gervais said that this was so that N could peacefully conclude the evening of her life in prayers and divine conversation. This was far from usual practice, and Gervais acknowledged this, but he wrote that he was compelled to grant the concession after meditating on the parable of the workers in the vineyard. If the Lord looked kindly even on those who didn't begin work until the 11th hour, then neither N's age nor her lack of virginity would be held against her if her motivations for entering the order were pure. We can add other written sources to Gervais's letter, which show that Premonstratensian sisters remained part of their communities long after that supposed 1198 cutoff point. Medieval Christians believed that the remembrance of a name had power. For your name to be included in a litany of prayers for the faithful dead gave you a much better shot at eternal salvation. One form that such litanies took was a text called an obituary. This is a page from one of the obituaries kept at the Abbey of Prémontré during the Middle Ages. Particularly respected members of the order were included in the community's obituary on their death. If you were included in it, you would be prayed for daily for the first year after your death. A Mass was celebrated for you on the 7th and 30th days after your death, and on your first-year anniversary, and then annually after that on your anniversary. Other members of the order were to recite 40 Our Fathers and the full Psalter in your honour. Doing all of this would have kept the deceased firmly in the minds of their surviving community members. On this day alone, April the 2nd, the community of Prémontré prayed for the souls of Sisters Hersonde, Liegeard, and Mathilde of the house at Henap. Now, obituaries are texts that are frequently overlooked by historians, and you can probably guess why from looking at this page, even if you don't read much Latin. They are not thrilling reads with a narrative or a cliffhanger, right? They're just lists of names, occasionally enlivened by things like, who gave us 2 shillings, or who gave us a field. But trawling through obituaries has been of enormous help to me in my work on the Premonstratensian sisters. Not only do they show that women were part of communities like Prémontré, but they've also helped me to identify previously unknown communities of Premonstratensian sisters in medieval France. This is the former house of Sillon-Gouffern in Normandy. No history previously written of the order says that there were women there. In fact, some of them flat out state that there were none. However, in going through the obituary, I found at least 41 women who were members of the community in the 12th and early 13th centuries. They likely lived at 2 nearby sites, Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive and Boissy-Lalonde, which hadn't previously been identified as Premonstratensian courtes. But the women were there, hiding in plain sight. I found a similar case with La Casedieu in Gascony in the far south of modern France. One of the main historians of the Premonstratensian order in the 20th century, Norbert wrote that there is, quote, not the least vestige of nuns, either in the obituary or in the archives of the house. Well, I went and I looked at the obituary. On this day, we commemorate the brothers and sisters of our house and all those others who rest in our cemetery. That is on March the 13th, so maybe Bachmann didn't get very far in to the obituary. There are lots more women who are mentioned elsewhere in the manuscript. As well as obituaries, there are other late medieval or early modern texts which show that even after sisters no longer lived at a particular spot, their brothers kept their memory alive. A short biography written in the 17th century, for instance, is one of our best sources of evidence about this lady, a woman called Riquer. At some point between 1120 and 1126, Riquer, Lady of Clastres, gave all of her property to Prémontré and entered the religious life there. In so doing, she became, it is claimed, and as Dr. Sands earlier pointed out, the very first female Premonstratensian. She directed the sisters, she helped to staff the Xenodochium, or hospital cum guest house. The biography attributes some very larger-than-life attributes to her. It claimed that she suffered from demonic possession, maybe indicating that she struggled with bouts of physical or mental illness. It also states that she worked a miracle. At one point, a raging fire threatened Prémontré's Xenodochium, and Riquera made the sign of the cross over the fire, and it was miraculously put out. The respect with which Riquera was held for generations after her death, the fact that certain spots at the monastery were still being pointed out as associated with her well into the 17th century, and that miracles were associated with her, all of this tells us that it was possible for Premonstratensian men to respect their female counterparts. So when we put all of this together, what do we get? Not necessarily a golden age for Premonstratensian sisters. They may not have had to do battle with moustache-twirling villains as a matter of course, but there's not necessarily a go-girl narrative of empowering history here either. And I think that's why they matter, because they largely led fairly standard lives for women religious in the Middle Ages, because they weren't exceptional, because they were living lives which fit in with the expectations, the abilities, and the achievements of lots of other devout women all around them in medieval France. Because they worked within and with and around the hierarchies and systems of the time, because they have largely been overlooked by history. And because if we listen closely enough, despite it all, we might just be able to hear their voices. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Yvonne. That was wonderful, and I learned a lot, and I am one who is always anxious to learn even more about Premonstratensian history. This morning in our class, she mentioned that she considers herself a nerd, and I'm right there in that club with you. Anything to do with Premonstratensian history, I'm right there. So thank you for all of the insights that I gained tonight. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Seale, we've got a microphone here with Meredith. Please raise your hand, and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A.
I'm curious if any of the women, if you have any findings that if they simulated the Quakers, or not, excuse me, the Shakers, the Shaker community here in the U.S., sometimes women would go into the order with children, and the children would be part of the community, and I was wondering if you have any evidence of that.
I've got some limited evidence for that. So the statutes that I mentioned do talk about the fact that there are children who are part of the cloister, whether they are either, say, women who had children who entered the community and brought them with them. That's one possibility. Perhaps these are orphans, foster children, perhaps, who are being raised by members of the community. Perhaps they are children who are sent there in order to acquire an education. That's another possibility. Frustratingly, this is one of those questions where we've got scattered little pieces of evidence that we can read and interpret in a number of different ways. But the definitive answer to that is maybe it's still out there in an archive somewhere, but I'm afraid I can't provide it just yet.
Hi, I was wondering, was there a standard type of education for these women? Were they reading? Were they writing? Were they drawing? Anything that you know about that?
Sure. No, at this point there is no standard curriculum. There's no common core, right, in medieval Europe. It is a requirement if you're going to enter as a sister, the kind of religious woman who's later going to be called a choir sister, that you must at least know how to read in order to be able to read the divine service and to perform that several times a day. If you are a lay sister who's entering in, the conversa, it's not a requirement, although some of them seem to have learned how to read and write over time. Again, another one of the things that seems to define the French Premonstratensians from the German Premonstratensians in this period is that the French Premonstratensians do not seem to have been particularly interested in copying of manuscripts, or at least in the 12th and 13th centuries, a lot of them are not necessarily super interested in producing their own theological works. There are a couple of exceptions, but by and large that's true. Where there is evidence for Premonstratensian women being very involved in scholarly production is in Germany. And there's a great book by Alison Beach looking at the women of the community at Schäftlarn, which is the German house that I showed the image of earlier on. And they are very much involved with manuscript production, very elaborate, very elite manuscript production in this period. And they have a fantastic system where the brothers in the community are the scribes for the most part. And when they have finished their work on a manuscript or a particular part of a manuscript, there's a great account in one of the texts of how they pass the manuscript over the wall into the women's side of the community, and then the women take it and they do the illustrations or the illuminations of the text. So there we've got evidence of women being involved in quite a complex production of manuscripts, and also being hooked into those scholarly networks. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Seale. I just want to ask you about the obituaries. Is it clear from the text that the women who were being prayed for were in fact sisters rather than lay associates? Here at the St. Norbert Abbey, there are a number of lay people who attend Mass regularly, who are involved with the order, who identify with the order, but still aren't actually members officially of it. And I was just wondering if the evidence is really clear that these women actually were in the order.
Yes, this is one of the places where medieval people were actually super helpful and were making clear distinctions as to what was going on. So you've actually got a number of different ways for women to be commemorated within the obituary, or at least a number of different categories that are attached to them. If they are a member of a particular religious community, they will be referred to in the text as either soror, right? So soror Liegard or soror Mathilde. If they are one of those lay sisters, then they will be called a conversa. That term comes into use more at the end of the Middle Ages. There are also then two sort of further subdivisions of being a soror or a conversa. This is a soror ad succurrendum or a conversa ad succurrendum. And this means that essentially the woman in question had taken religious vows on her deathbed. She was therefore never lived as a member of the Premonstratensian community, but the fact that her last days had been spent having taken the vows of the order meant that she was considered in death to have been a full member, but there's still that little distinction that is made. Generally speaking then, if a woman does not have any of those terms attached to her, it's fairly safe to assume that she was a lay sister, or sorry, not a lay sister, that she was a lay woman. And oftentimes, particularly because she will be defined in terms of either who her father was or who her husband is. And those are generally pretty good markers that this is a woman who has not taken vows which remove her from the secular world.
I'm always interested how people first become aware of the Premonstratensians and what sparked your interest in pursuing it as a scholarly vocation.
Well, in this case, the fault is entirely that of my doctoral advisor, Constance Berman, who's a scholar of medieval women religious more generally, particularly though the Cistercian order. And I had just taken my comps exams at Iowa, where I did my PhD. If you've ever done a PhD, you'll know the particular torture that are the comps exams. If you have not done a PhD, save yourself now, there's still time. You've got to spend a year reading, at least for your main field, upwards of 200 books, in my case 400 books, in a year, plus journal articles, and then take an 8-hour exam. So that was fun. Most people in doing their comps exams, either going into them or by the end of them, they've got a sense of what it is that they want to write their dissertation on. I came through the other end and I was like, I still don't know what I want to do. I had a set of questions that I was interested in. I wanted to investigate things like women's power, women's agency, how women were able to act within an institution that was not necessarily set up to support them. But I didn't really know what archives were out there to let me ask those kinds of questions. So I went to Connie's office one day, and Connie is a knitter. She likes to knit, and I asked her, Connie, what do I do? Where do I go? And so she sort of reclined backwards in her chair and looked up at the ceiling for a really long time while knitting. And then she eventually sort of re-emerged from that fugue state and looked at me and said, either the Victorines or the Premonstratensians. No one's done much with those. Go. So I went to France and found, as I was doing a lot of sort of general and background reading, that I kept hitting up against this interesting question of various general texts kept telling me that there had been no Premonstratensian sisters after 1198, and yet I couldn't seem to move without tripping over one of them. So there was a problem here, a historical problem, and that got me interested. I was telling some of the students this morning that, a good historian is like a detective, right? Is like a puzzle solver, and anytime I trip over something that doesn't seem to make sense, that's really something that intrigues me as a historian. So the traditional narrative of the Premonstratensian women didn't make sense to me, and that's why I really sort of sunk my teeth into it.
What did you find as the date that Prémontré sisters were shut down?
As in the sisters at Prémontré itself?
Or in general that they were gone or abolished, because after medieval times, or?
So outside of France, outside of French-speaking areas, I should say, because Belgium and Switzerland and so on have large French-speaking communities, they continue right the way through. There's no particular end point. As I said, the community at Schäflarn lasts right the way through until 1803, when Napoleon rocks up in Germany and secularizes everything, right, and shuts down these communities. There are communities of Premonstratensian sisters, say in the Netherlands, that continue right the way through, that have a pretty much unbroken existence. Right, the Oosterhout, am I saying that correctly? Oosterhout community that has an unbroken existence that continues right the way through. In France, the material is more patchy, in part, as I said, because of all of this archival records that have just been lost. But we have got evidence of the community at Bonneuil lasting into the 15th century, and that's a house that's immediately, directly dependent on Prémontré. So if they really didn't like the women at Prémontré, why do they keep having them around until the 15th century? The community at Auxerre, we don't know the date at which that religious community stopped. It was later a parish church, and now it's part of a farm, as I said. But we know that they installed their last prioress in 1603. So that's well into the 17th century. The other example then is La Rochelle, which is founded in the 15th century in France. So not even just that it appears suddenly after a long existence, but it's founded in the 15th century in La Rochelle, and it lasts right the way through until the late 16th century, when the Huguenots take over La Rochelle as part of the Protestant Wars of Religion in France. Then the community starts to dwindle, but we've still got some names of these sisters. And the very last sister to survive from that community passes away in, I want to say, sometime in the 1570s or 1580s. And she bequeaths the church to the local Catholic community to use as a parish church, which I think is what it has been in use for until very, very recently. It's now, I think, a performing arts centre in La Rochelle. So here you have got examples of not many, but still definite confirmed survivals of these communities. So you can see why I was confused, right? All of these texts are telling me one thing, all of these women are telling me another.
Question, because this is my first time getting information about sisters. Are there any still?
Yes.
Today?
There are
Okay.
lots. You can go visit the Centre for Norbertine Studies, and Rosemary will happily show you lots and lots of stuff about them. And outside the special collections in the library, there's some fantastic photographs right now of the sisters in Oosterhout. In particular, they are sort of entrepreneurial women. They used to be into bookbinding, and now they are in wine production. So if you would like your very own Norbertine branded wine, that's something to look into. Apparently the packaging mimics the veil and habit of a sister. So if you know someone who's super into both Norbertines and wine, now you've got your Christmas shopping sorted already.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you again, Yvonne. It was an absolute delight. Thank you, all of you who came. As I was standing there, I could kind of survey the room, and I can see my students out there. I can see a number of Norbertines. I see Norbertine associates. I see members of our board of trustees. I see members of the administration of the college. I see many colleagues out there and community members. So thank you very, very much for attending. A little P.S. My area of expertise are the Norbertines in Spain, not specifically the sisters, although that's next on my list. But there are two communities still in existence in Spain, and they date back to a duplex house in Zamora. They were spun off in 1306 to Toro, Spain, and those sisters are still there. They've been in their present building continuously since 1316. They got so large around 1515 that they spun off and started another house in Vioria de Orbigo, and that group of sisters finally had to move out of that monastery, which used to be male, then it became female in 1515. The order has owned that property since 1243. And the sisters had to be moved to a home for retired religious. There were 5 who moved out in 2015. I visited them this past May when I was in Spain, and there are only 3 remaining. They're quite elderly, but they seem to be doing fine in their home for retired religious, even though the monastery was the only home they had known their entire lives. These women joined the order probably in their late teens, early 20s at the very latest, and here they are, 80s and 90s, and their life has been turned a little bit upside down, but they're there. So there are two communities still around in Spain, and there were several others, but most of the others disappeared. They were spin-offs from double monasteries, and they disappeared somewhere before the 16th century. Those all were gone except for Toro and Vioria. So that's it. But thank you very much again to Dr. Seale. Thank you to all of you. And stay tuned. Be sure to pick up your swag out front. And we've got a save the date postcard for our spring lecture series. And thank you again. And thank you to our musicians who also remained.